Well, we finished chapter 25 last week, and miraculously, it would seem, we finished that chapter in 2 Sundays. So we zoomed our way through it. Chapter 26, however, if you notice, is over 70 verses long. So it's going to take us a while to get through that. Now, I'm not exactly sure why the editors way back when decided to make this one 75 verses, but I think in a sense because it tells kind of a unified story, they kept it all in one chapter. But we're going to start out, and we probably are not going to get very far. But before we really begin into chapter 26, I wanted to go back to, if you remember, my funky outline of Matthew. It's an outline that is usually different from what is commonly put out there as an outline of Matthew. A lot of people, and I won't say most, but a lot of people outline Matthew based on teaching and narrative segments. And they divide it into 5 principal constructs. And they say how that mirrors the 5 books of the Torah. Or, they bring some interesting things into light. And you can kind of divide it that way if you want. And you can see where they go with it. But when I happened on this one and cobbled it together, it made so much more sense to me. And so this is the one that I would bring to the table. Steve actually said this morning a lot of movies and a lot of your cinematography uses this design. When you talk about a climax and when you talk about the build-up and then the I don't remember what the word is, but the resolution and things like that, they use this idea of the chiastic structure or the chiasmus when they're looking at developing a story. Well, it's not new. This has been used throughout all of ancient history, and that's just one more tool that we have. It actually puts things together in a way that people can remember, especially when you're talking about an oral society. Not as much was written down. If you were going to retain something, it was because you heard it and you carried it in memory with you. And so let's go back to the outline and kind of show where we are, because we are moving into a new section. We started out Matthew with the idea of heaven, and this is where God lived, and this is where Jesus lived. Well, at some point in early Matthew, we talked about the birth of Jesus. So God came down to earth, and we talked through the birth of Jesus. And then it skips pretty quickly. Remember all of those years that we don't really get a sense of Jesus' upbringing. We had that little episode when he was 12 in the temple, but by and large, we don't know what happened in his early years, his teenage years, his early adulthood. But when we get to about 30-ish, we start seeing a ministry start being set up. And that's when we really start seeing the Jesus purpose, the Messiah, the Messianic plan come to fruition. So we see this ministry startup happen. And that's basically, Greg talked about it this morning. John the Baptist baptized Jesus. And then Jesus went into the wilderness and was tempted by Satan. And then he gathered together his disciples. And so he's kind of getting things going for the ministry. Then we see a segment of teaching that I called kingdom living. And the world commonly knows that section as the Sermon on the Mount. And we talked through all of the Sermon on the Mount. So we see this section on kingdom living. And then we see the narratives that play out in his Galilean ministry. We get to the Mount of Transfiguration. And this is the climax of Matthew. Matthew's been building up. And when you get to the pinnacle of the chiasmus structure, that's the key point. That's what the author really wants you to take home. And so here we see the declaration of Jesus as Messiah. Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And then we have the episode of the Transfiguration where God himself proclaims Jesus as his son. And not only that, but he does so in the presence of 2 witnesses. Who were those witnesses at the Transfiguration? Okay, we had human witnesses, absolutely. Peter, John, and James. Moses and Elijah were present in that declaration. Moses represents the law. Elijah represents the prophets. We see that idea also take shape throughout the Bible, and you see it again when it comes to Revelation. You see Moses and Elijah there. So that's a big thing. Not only is it declared by Peter and humans, it was declared by God in the presence of Moses and Elijah. And you had to have two witnesses for any testimony to stand up in the court of law. And the testimony of two witnesses, the likes of Moses and Elijah, would be huge. So that is the peak of what the Jews needed to hear. And then we start backing back out. We went through the Judean ministry. We had a little bit of segment when he went into Caesarea Philippi. You remember that. And then just after that, not long after that, he started moving toward Jerusalem. And we start seeing that Judean ministry. Now, did it actually happen, what's my word? In that timeline, was he only in Galilee in the early part of the ministry, and was he only in Judea in the last part of his ministry? No. He did go back and forth. We know he was a good Jew. He went to festivals. Sometimes he hesitated to go to some of those festivals for a reason. We talked about a few of those. But this is the design of Matthew. Matthew is actually leading the reader toward a certain point. So, we've talked about the Galilean ministry, now we've talked about the Judean ministry. We just finished up, after having finished chapter 25, the preparation narratives. Now that is kind of where he's getting his disciples to try to understand the scope of what's about to happen and what is going to need to happen after he ascends. They will still continue the ministry, and he's trying to urge them on in that. And so we've just finished that up in chapter 25. And now we get to a very, very short element of ministry closure or wind down. And this is just the brief time period in Matthew especially. Matthew does not detail much of it. But brief timeline between those preparation narratives and the passion itself. And so we're going to talk about that today. Along with this is the Lord's Supper, or we in today's world we call it the Seder meal, and we'll talk about that and why it's called the Seder meal, but it actually has a different name. It's the Passover feast. And then we get to the death, the sacrifice of Jesus, and then we have the episode where he ascends. So at the end of the picture, we're back in heaven, or our focus is back toward heaven. So here's where we are. Right at the ministry closure. Things are winding down. Jesus he knows the game plan, and he's already driving events toward the game plan. We'll talk about that today. In fact, that's one of the first things we're going to talk about, how Jesus is now driving this. So when we get into this, as we read the first few verses of chapter 26, it says, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, what things? Well, those things that he was telling the disciples, which actually started with the question, Jesus, when is all this going to occur? And so then we get this whole long narrative about what's about to happen, about their ministry work, and about the support that they need, or the emotional support that they will need throughout that ministry work. And when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, as you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Now, he says they know that, but I'm not sure that's soaked in yet. I think maybe at this point they believe that he'll be handed over to be crucified, but Jesus has escaped death many times so far. And so I think they still have it in their head that that's a setup. That's it's something that's going to happen, that somehow miraculously Jesus is going to come out victorious in a physical way. That's really all I want to say about that. I don't know. It's hard to say what's actually in their head, but you come to the table with a certain line of thinking. It's really hard to change that line of thinking, even when it's someone important trying to tell you that it's a little different. And I think we're going to see that really play out, possibly even when we get to Judas and talk through Judas. So, the chief priests, on the other hand, I love this. The way Matthew sets this up, it's almost like a soap opera. I'm not a fan of soap operas anyway, but I think it's funny how you only get like snippets in a soap opera. It goes to this scene, then it goes to this scene, then it goes to this scene, and then it was trying to package everything happening together so that at some point it all culminates, it all comes together, and boom, you get the climax, you get that thing that happens. Well, that's kind of what's happening here, and I should say, not just soap operas, but Lord of the Rings. Peter Jackson did the same thing with Lord of the Rings. You go over here and you see this episode running, and then you see this one, and you wonder, how on earth does that tie together? Well, they don't until later. Well, so that's what we have here. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and then we flip scenes, and now we're talking about the chief priests and the elders and what they're doing. So in verse 3, the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace. That word in my Bible says palace of the high priest. That could have been the outer courts. What we do know is it must have been a fairly significant sized estate. We do know the chief priest had a lot of assets over time. They had accumulated quite a bit. So the word kind of relates to open air. And we see later, when we get to the trials of Jesus, that a lot of people were meeting in that court, in that same area. That's the area where we are when Peter denies Jesus. And so it's very possible that it could hold quite a few people, but we honestly don't know what the size of the place looks like. But they're meeting in this place of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. And I don't know whether to talk about Caiaphas now or not, but let me just say that Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas. Now, Annas, we might know as Ananias. Ananias was high priest at one time, but the Romans deposed him. Now, according to the laws of the Jews, you were high priest until you died. But Romans were running the country. And so the Romans deposed Annas of that responsibility. However, in the eyes of the people, Annas still had the high regard as high priest. So you will still see him called high priest. And we saw him as high priest when we talked about the destruction of Jerusalem, because he is still in the mix. His name is still in the mix. He had a lot of sons, and those sons in succession had high priestly roles. And he's the one that said, about whom was said, you must be like truly honored because all of your sons were high priests. Well, now in this scenario, his son-in-law is the high priest, Caiaphas, has been for a number of years. But we'll see later in the trials of Jesus, Annas is still highly regarded and respected by the people as a high priest. And so we'll get to that later. The high priest is also, especially Annas' role, responsible for the monetary control of the temple. So when you start thinking about Jesus and what Jesus had done earlier in this week, remember he came into the temple and did what to the money changers?
Kicked them out.
He disrupted their world. Now, if you're Annas or Caiaphas and you're responsible for the money of the temple, that would concern you, wouldn't it? Who is this guy? All right, so they were meeting. It says the chief priests and elders of the people were meeting in this home of Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him, but not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. A couple things. We don't know who was in the courtyard having that discussion. We don't know who was in the courtyard in the trials of Jesus, having that trial, the mock trial of Jesus. There are a lot of people that believe that it was really just the Sadducees, because it does say chief priests and the elders of the people, and the chief priests tended to be Sadducean. Okay. However you look at John actually includes Pharisees in the mix. And presumably John was there. He was present when things happened. He knew somebody, so he was able to get in. So we don't know that. But let's talk about this, not during the festival, or there would be a riot among the people. And once again, what festival is this? What's happening about the same time? It was 2 days before Passover. Passover was the huge festival in the land. Passover was the meal that they partook of, they ate, that brought to mind what? What was the driving essence of Passover? To remember what?
The stones and And that was the start of their leaving out of there.
Out of Egypt. Out of Egypt. It was to remember God's saving the people out of the Egyptian hands and the slavery and the frustrating experience they had in Egypt. And we could go all the way back. In fact, let's do that just a little bit. Let's go back to Exodus. When we look at Exodus verse 11. I'm sorry, chapter 11. Yeah, Exodus verse 11. How many of those are there? You know, before we do that, there's a verse in John that I want to talk about or just read to you, having to do with Caiaphas and the people and their fear. So I'm going to read. You don't have to go there, but I'm going to read John 11. Just stepping back a moment, John 11, 47-ish. When we talked about Jesus was popular and the Caiaphas and the leaders of the Jews were concerned about Jesus' popularity, and if they arrested him while a bunch of people were in Jerusalem, then they would cause a riot. Let me read what John has to say. And timing is a little unusual here, but this is basically when Jesus healed Lazarus and word got back to the Pharisees. And they're saying, oh, what is it that we're really doing here? What are we driving here? And so they say, what are we accomplishing? Here is this man performing many signs, and if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come. Mind you, listen to this. It's not everyone will believe in him and maybe we should too. It's everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. So what was their primary focus?
They don't want to lose control.
They didn't want to lose control. They wanted their position and their power. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, we heard him, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You don't realize, or don't you realize, basically, it's better for you that one man die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. He didn't say this of his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. And not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So, verse 53, from that day on, they plotted to take his life, because they felt like killing Jesus was to the benefit of the nation. Because if Jesus kept on, then Jesus would somehow compel the Romans to come in and take over and do away with their power, do away with what they perceived as their religious network, their religious position, and the Jewish religion as a whole. Little did they know he was kind of right. But all right, so I just wanted to bring that up. I had skipped over that. Another thing, they said, let's not do this during Passover, because there were tons of people in the city of Jerusalem at that time. If you look at scholars and what they believe the population of Jerusalem was, you'll get one or two who think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 20,000. Now, I think they have a bone to pick, and they're actually shooting very low for a particular reason. And I think that's actually inexcusable scholarship. Because to believe that there were only 20,000 in a city as well known and well regarded as Jerusalem. Every nation wanted Jerusalem because of its location. Now, they realized the Jews were hard to deal with, but it was also at the crossroads of a lot of different global travel. So everybody wanted that. And to think that it only had 20,000 people, I think, is inexcusable, especially one who had as many people in the nation, and a city that was very central to the nationalism of that nation, nationalism of the nation. But also, we see that there was a lot of concern from the Romans about that city. It's more likely that there were citizens of Jerusalem, people that lived in that city year-round, 80 to 90, maybe 100,000 people. Now, this is not a big city. This is not like the metropolitan area of Tulsa with 100,000 people. This is like even smaller possibly than the metropolitan area of Broken Arrow. Small walls. I mean, it was a small location, and to cram that many people throughout the year into that size was pretty significant. But during Passover, one of the big three festivals where Jews were compelled to come to Jerusalem, compelled by law in a lot of cases, and we could go back to that, the population at that time would have swollen considerably. So not only do you have the normal 100,000 people living there, but you also have all these visitors from abroad. Everyone within 15 miles, I think it was 15, the local region was required to be there. And then if you could travel from beyond that, then you were compelled to be there too. If you look at Josephus is prone to overestimations, but he leads scholars to believe that there are as many as 2.5 million people in the area at that time. That's probably an overstatement. Tacitus, he believes, or the reason we get to that number is he said the priests counted 250,000, actually a little bit more than 250,000, I think I actually have it somewhere. Nope, didn't write it down. 250,000 sacrifices for the Passover sacrifices, Passover lambs. And at that time, scholars believed that you had to have at least 10 people, 10 families to a sacrifice. So or 10 people to a sacrifice. So if you say 250,000 sacrifices, at least 10 people per sacrifice, that extrapolates out to 2.5 million. That's how they get there. Tacitus will tell you, Tacitus, the Roman historian, will tell you that more probably it's about 600,000. Now, the numbers that they're giving is actually talking about AD 70 and the destruction of Jerusalem. So over time, you might have had more and more and more and more people coming. So in the time of Christ, it might have been a few less. But I think Tacitus' number is probably closer to accurate. 600,000 could be 500,000. There's a lot of people, and that's a lot of people crammed into this one location. And because of the overflow, because of the number of people, the Roman garrison was built up. The procurate would bring additional troops into Jerusalem to oversee and make sure the peace is kept. So this is a concern. This is why the leaders of the Jews didn't want to arrest Jesus during the festival. And remember, when Jesus came into Jerusalem, how did he come in? With a parade. He had an entourage. He had a lot of people behind him, supporting him, honoring him, glorifying him. Hosanna! We don't want to buck that right now. However, God had other plans. And this is where I said earlier, God is driving this. God is making activities happen now. So the leaders said, not yet. And God said, no, now. So now we're going to talk about Passover, and why did God say now? Why was it that it was important, it is important to God, and not to be presumptive, but to put two and two together? Why is it important for God that the passion happen right now? Christ was the Passover lamb. So let's talk about Passover and how that occurred. Absolutely. Exodus 13. Actually, no, 11. Exodus 11. This gets back to the plagues that God brought on Egypt when the Israelites were captives or slaves in Egypt. And remember, the Pharaoh did not want to let them go. This was the Pharaoh that didn't know Joseph. This was the Pharaoh that didn't appreciate Joseph, didn't like Joseph. It wasn't that he wasn't aware of Joseph. And so, the Lord said to Moses, verse 1 of 11, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. So he'd already brought 9, and they didn't work. After that, he will let you go from here. And when he does, he will drive you out completely. Tell the people that men and women alike are to ask their neighbors for articles of silver and gold. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and Moses himself was highly regarded in Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and by the people. Well, why would that be? Because he had magic. He was highly regarded because he was the spokesperson for the God that's bringing all of these plagues. Don't mess with him. But Pharaoh had a hard head and a hard heart. And then God confirmed that hard heart even further. Not only that, I mean, older people might have remembered, Moses started out in the Pharaoh's family. For 40 years, he was part of the Pharaoh's family. So some of those older people may have remembered that and regarded him because of that. Verse 4. So Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go through Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, and the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her handmill, and all firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there ever has been or ever will be. So God is saying, look, I am about to kill the firstborn. Firstborn, keep that in your mind. Firstborn is very important. Jesus was considered the firstborn, the only born of God. So it's not like God didn't know how that felt. Okay. Among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All of these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, go, you and all the people who follow you. After that, I will leave. Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh. The Lord had said to Moses, Pharaoh will refuse to listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in Egypt. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Let's talk about that. That he would not let Israel go out of his country. Does the Lord keep people from the free will that he's given them? We just read, it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, if Pharaoh didn't have a choice in the matter, then how fair is that?
I think he did have a choice.
Help me understand that.
Because God knew him and knew what he would do, and so he just kind of gave him that broken window.
Yes, that's exactly what I think. God confirms our choices. And so we have the choice, we have the free will to make the decision. But once we've made that decision, if we're committed to that decision, God will confirm it. God will say, okay, if that's the way it's going to be, that's the way it's going to be, and he will work from there. And he will make it such that his glory will be shown because of that decision, despite you. So God did not actively harden Pharaoh's heart. He confirmed the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. He said, he certified it basically. He said, that's who you are, that's who you're going to be, and I'm going to use that to my glory. Through that hardness, I will show the world how powerful, how glorified I am. We see that again in Judas, when we talk through Judas. We'll circle back to that. Because a lot of people say, Judas didn't have a choice in the matter. So we'll talk through that again. But I wanted to kind of bring that up because a lot of people do go that route and say, well, it was predestined. He didn't have a choice in the matter. He did. I think he did. I think that's how one should read that phrase. He confirmed the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. And so in chapter 12 of Exodus, we just read about the plague. We just read about what God is going to do in Egypt. But in chapter 12, we're going to read about how Israel is going to escape that. Because remember, the Israelites are living in Egypt, and they just said, everyone from Pharaoh all the way down to the female slave, this is going to occur to. So how does Israel get out of it? Well, God gives them some instructions, and that instruction starts in verse 12, or chapter 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this month is to be for you the first month. So he's setting out a new calendar for the Jews. If you try to figure out the Jewish calendar, it is very confusing because they have two first months of the years. They have the religious first month of the year, and then they have the standard, what everyone else sees as the first month of the year. So he's setting the new first month of the year. This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, then he must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. Now that is where we get the idea of 10 people to a sacrifice. Because if you have a family of 4, it's really hard for that family of 4 to fully consume that lamb. Because that's what they were instructed to do. Fully consume it. If anything is left over, burn it. But you're to make the attempt to fully consume it. So you wanted to have enough people available to help you eat this thing. All right, so that's where we get the 10 people to a sacrifice. You were to see verse 5. The animals you choose. Oh, I didn't notice this, or I didn't say anything about this. We've said this before, but remember it said on the 10th of the month you need to find your lamb. We made note of this when Jesus came into Jerusalem. We said that was the 10th of the month. The lamb was chosen. Jesus, the lamb, was chosen on the 10th of the month. We kind of made note of that. It's kind of interesting how things fall into place. And here we're talking about the leaders saying, we don't want to do this while the festival's running. And God is saying, no, this is exactly the time we want this to happen. And this is why. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, because something special happens on the 14th. When all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. So on the eve of the 14th, which is the 14th in the Jewish system, because their day starts in the evening and ends in the evening. So the eve of the 14th, they are to slaughter the animal and to cook it, and we'll see to eat it. Verse 7, they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over a fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. This is where I said they're supposed to consume it. They're supposed to consume all of it. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. Why were they supposed to eat it in haste? Pharaoh was about to kick them out, and God was going to say, let's go. Now, because they left in haste, there was also something else about this dinner that they were required to do. How many of you have cooked bread? What do you do that takes a long time when you cook bread? You let it rise. You put leaven in it, some sort of leavening agent, and then you put it in a fairly warm place and you let it rise. Well, if you're trying to do all of this in haste, you don't have time to let it rise. So you skip that leaven part. And that's where we get this idea of unleavened bread. Okay. All right. Verse 12, on that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. Notice it says and animals. And I will bring judgment on all of the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. So it's the blood of the lamb sprinkled on the doorposts that signifies that faith community. That person, or the family that's inside that home, had trust in the power of that lamb to keep them from the judgment, to keep them from the plague. This is a day that you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. And then here we go. For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your houses, for whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th must be cut off from Israel. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the 7th day. Do no work at all on these days, except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. Celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for generations to come. In the first month you were to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your houses, and anyone, whether foreigner or native born, who eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. This is a huge deal. So what we have, and I know we're short on time, we'll revisit this again next week a little bit, but let me lay this down. What we have is a failure to communicate. No. The 14th of Nisan. Nisan it's also known as Azib. There's another name for the first month of the year. But by the time we get to the first entry, it's Nisan. First, on the 14th day of Nisan, that's the day of Passover. On the next day, the 15th, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or the Festival of Unleavened Bread, begins. Okay? And it runs for 17 days. Now, mind you, they also have to eat unleavened bread on this day. So what we often get is, and we get this in the New Testament, in fact, the disciples themselves say it. It says, when on the first day of unleavened bread, it's time to prepare the Passover meal. Okay, so what they did was they incorporated the Passover meal in this whole episode of unleavened bread, the festival. But technically speaking, the festival of unleavened bread started on the 15th, and then you had the Passover on the 14th. The Passover, we'll revisit again because we didn't have time to cover it in depth, but we'll talk thoroughly about the Passover as we get into the Lord's Supper later on in this chapter. But the Passover was emblematic of the Lord's judgment and the passing over of that judgment because of the blood of the Lamb. Okay, people who had the faith community who used their trust in God via the vehicle of the Passover lamb escaped the judgment. That's what that was all about. But in the Seder meal, it also talks about leaving Egypt, and it talks about God's provision, okay, and redemption. So then we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The unleavening was emblematic of the haste with which they had to get out. But it also, as we get into the first century, we start seeing this idea of leavening representing some evil. So one might also say unleavened bread also is emblematic of purity or holiness. Okay, so we have, God has said, you are to commemorate Passover. You are also to commemorate the festival of unleavened bread for a whole week, actually 7 days. So, and the first day of that is to be called a Sabbath, because you're not supposed to do any work. You don't do anything on that first day. So the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or Festival of Unleavened Bread, is called a Sabbath. Now, there was discussion or discrepancy even among the Jews what that meant. Were they to wait until the subsequent Sabbath after the Passover? Because the Passover was always on the 14th, whether it was a Sabbath or not. Didn't matter. So there was a question then was, well, should the Sabbath that is indicated for the Festival of Unleavened Bread be a typical Sabbath that is subsequent to Passover, or is it truly immediately the next day, the 15th? I believe Sadducees and Pharisees probably had a disagreement on that. Pharisees saw it one way, Sadducees saw it another way. But anyway, generally speaking, the 15th was looked at as the beginning date for that. There's another one, and we don't have time to read it. We might pick it up next week because I think it's important, especially when it comes to Jesus, that's called the first fruits. The feast of the first, or the festival of the first fruits, the feast of the first fruits. It doesn't say a day in the Bible, but what it says is the day immediately following the Sabbath. That is within this time period. So, again, this was considered a Sabbath. So the 16th was first fruits. We'll circle that back to this again next week, but look at this. Jesus died on Passover Day. He was raised again. He was raised from death on the third day as the first fruits. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, he was the first fruit of the resurrection. Day 1, part of the Passover, because a part of a day constituted one day for the Jews. Day 1, day 2, day 3. So God says, no, we're not waiting till after the festival. Now is the time for all this to occur. Because it fits with everything I have been driving for throughout the whole Old Testament. And that's why when you're a Christian, it's really important to understand the Old Testament too. Because it's all one story. We'll get back to that again next week, but I wanted to show that to you and why I think it matters that it happens right now. And God is saying now is the time. We're not waiting till after this festival's over. This festival is what it's all about. And it provides the meaning behind what happens to Jesus. I'm sorry, behind what Jesus chose to do. Because it didn't happen to Jesus. He chose for it to happen. And on that note, let's pray. Father, it's amazing when we look at the entire story, even as far back as creation itself, and to see how you have designed things to occur. How you have made things to occur even in the scope of the free will of humanity. It's amazing how all the pieces fit together when we understand the scope of your word. And it's exciting, actually, to know that you are the master of all things and that we have an avenue to relate to you, to eventually in eternity live with you. And that avenue is provided through your Son, our Savior Jesus. Help us to never forget that. Help us to always live with that spirit in our hearts and that knowledge in our minds and that message on our lips. Thank you, Father, for the community we live in, for the people that we have around us, that we may lift each other up, strengthen each other, and even hold each other accountable to be ambassadors for you and to share the message of your word and the saving grace of Jesus, because it didn't happen to him. He chose to take upon himself the pain of guilt, the judgment of death that was truly ours. He took that away from us so that we may not have to experience it. Help us to share that message to the world around us, that more and more and more people can see you and to live with you eternally because of Jesus. It's through him, Lord, we pray. Amen.